Our journey today begins in Scotland in 1473 in a small stone cottage late at night. Here, a peat fire burns low, the wind presses against the walls, and in the half light near the hearth, a newborn sleeps. Beneath her cradle, a piece of iron rests where it can be felt but not seen. Near the bed, a small knife lies close by. Iron nails bite into the doorframe. The threshold is marked. The door is bolted. The mother does not sleep. She listens, not for wolves nor thieves, but for the fair folk, the beings that lie just on the other side of perception. To modern eyes, these objects placed carefully by the mother look like superstition, but to medieval ones, they were necessary protection. Because in this world, children needed to be guarded, not only from hunger, illness, and the cold, but from something believed to watch, to wait, and to intrude. In medieval Europe, it was feared that without these countermeasures, a child could be taken away and replaced with something that was not of this world. By the late Middle Ages, belief in fairies was a fully formed tradition, shaped by centuries of storytelling, local custom, and inherited memory. To medieval people, fairies were not metaphors or moral fables. They were a category of beings discussed as seriously as angels, demons, or distant peoples. The roots of this belief stretch far back beyond the medieval period. Classical writers did not speak of fairies as such, but Greek and Roman authors regularly described intermediate beings, spirits of place, nature, and threshold, who occupied the space between gods and humans. Writers such as Plutarch and Apuleius referred to daimones, entities neither wholly divine nor mortal, capable of influence in human life for good or ill. These were not yet fairies, but they established a crucial idea, that the world was populated by other intelligences close at hand, yet not fully visible. By the 15th century, this belief had crystallized into distinct regional traditions, remarkably consistent in structure, even though names and stories differed. In Scotland, fairies were most commonly known as the Sidhe, a term derived from the word for mound or hill. The Sidhe were not imagined as tiny creatures, but as human-sized beings, organized into their own societies and closely associated with ancient landscapes, burial mounds, hills, ruined forts, and remote glens. They were neither fully demonic nor fully benign. They were often described as beautiful, flawless at first glance, and yet different, neighbours of another order, and bound by their own laws and customs, capable of generosity if respected, and swift retaliation if offended. It was from this careful attitude that one of the most enduring names arose. They were often referred to as the fair folk, not as a statement of goodness, but of propriety. In medieval speech, fair did not simply mean attractive. It meant ordered, correct, and in accordance with custom. To call them fair was to acknowledge that they lived by rules, and that those rules deserved to be respected. It was also safer to speak well of them than to risk offence by speaking plainly. Across the Irish Sea, similar beings were remembered under a different name. Medieval Irish tradition speaks of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a powerful race who inhabited the land before humans. When defeated, they did not vanish. Instead, they withdrew into the earth, into the hills, and the hidden places, becoming the Esshida, the people of the mounds. Further north, Scandinavian traditions describe the Huldulfolk, the hidden people, believed to live inside rocks, hills, and outcrops. Like the Sidhe, they were imagined as physically real, social beings with families, farms, and moral expectations. Even into the early modern period, Icelandic and Norwegian communities recorded cases of roads diverted or building sites abandoned in order to avoid offending them. And along Europe's coastlines, another variation appeared, the Selkies, beings capable of shedding animal skins to take human form. All these stories, found in Scotland, Ireland, and further afield, reflected the same underlying pattern. Entities that existed and moved between worlds, bound by rules, visible at moments of transition, and dangerous when crossed. And when we look at the fairy folklore across all these traditions, we can find some striking common ground. To grow up in medieval Europe was to grow up knowing that the world was shared, not metaphorically, but practically. From childhood, people were taught that fairies lived near and not far away. They were not imagined as inhabitants of some distant fantasy realm, but as neighbours whose presence overlapped with everyday life. Fairies were believed to dwell at the edges of human settlement, in the folds of hills, in burial mounds left untouched by the plough, in ruined forts whose builders were long forgotten, in forests marking the limits of cultivation, and along the shorelines where land and sea exchanged authority, twice a day. Fairy dwellings were thought to exist alongside the human world, but were not always corporeal, often invisible and revealed only by accident, or at certain hours or times of the year. Certain signs or markings might denote the presence of fairies, and places could get a reputation for being a home of the fair folk. Medieval fairies were not solitary beings. They were believed to exist in ordered communities, governed by hierarchies that mirrored human society. Many traditions spoke of fairy courts, ruled by kings and queens whose authority was absolute within their domains. Medieval sources described fairy society as bound by custom, laws of hospitality, obligation, exchange, and insult. Fairies could be generous, even helpful, but never freely so. Every gift implied a debt. Every favour created an obligation. Indeed, food left out overnight might be taken, or might signal goodwill. Tools found mysteriously cleaned, or work inexplicably completed, were not miracles. They were reminders of who also inhabited the land. In England, household spirits such as Robin Goodfellow, or Puck, embodied medieval fairy logic perfectly. He could churn butter, sweep floors, or complete domestic tasks during the night. But he could just as easily sour milk, tangle hair, or lead travellers astray. The difference lay not in his nature, but in the human behaviour he observed, or received. Of all the beliefs concerning fairies, the idea of them existing around boundaries was the strongest. It was believed their world ran alongside human life, but on the fringes, the periphery, just out of eyeshot or reach, but still close enough to touch it at certain moments. People said the fair folk were therefore most likely to be encountered at transitional moments, when one state slipped into another, at dusk and dawn, at midwinter and midsummer, at the turning of the seasons, and in the quiet instant before sleep. These moments included death, but above all birth stood apart as the time the fair folk were thought to notice and interact with the human world the most. This is because in medieval times, the life of a newborn was thought to be very much on a threshold. Although they had been born into the world, it was felt that they were not yet fully present within it. It was believed that it took a few days and rituals, such as baptism, to anchor a soul to the body, and before this, souls might choose not to take up a life after all. This belief was especially strong in an age when infant mortality could approach half of all births. Upon having a baby, people simply did not know if their offspring would grow up to live well, or slip away after a few days, or even a few moments. As such, to medieval people, newborns existed in a fragile in-between state, suspended between arrival and departure, presence and absence. But this was also the realm of the fairy. And so, since their states matched each other so perfectly, it was feared that the fair folk could see a newborn and could interact with the child to such an extent that they might even decide to take it for their own. The fear that fairies might steal human children was one of the most widespread and enduring beliefs of medieval Europe. It appears in Scottish, Irish, English, Scandinavian, and German sources with remarkable consistency, not as an isolated superstition, but as a shared explanation for the loss of an infant, unexplained illness, and a sudden change in behaviour. Without the benefits of medical science, and far from centres of learning, many communities understood such events through the logic of fairy society. Fairies, it was believed, desired human children for reasons that reflected their own precarious existence. Some traditions held that the fair folk were an aging race, long-lived but slowly diminishing, unable to replenish their numbers, as humans did. Others believed they lacked souls and sought to secure their future by taking human ones in the form of newborns. In other stories, fairies were thought to envy human vitality, the warmth, growth, and promise that children embodied. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. A healthy infant might suddenly weaken. A contented baby might become restless, listless, or unresponsive. A child might fail to grow as expected, cry inconsolably, or appear strangely altered. In such moments, a mother's grief was given meaning. The child had been taken, and a changeling left behind. It was believed that fairy custom bound them, and meant that they could not steal a child without giving something in return. As a result, the infant would be replaced with a substitute, a fairy child, a changeling. This would be made to resemble the original child almost exactly, but would never quite behave the same way. This belief did not remove the sorrow felt in any negative changes that might occur in an infant. It simply redirected it. In a world without genetics, neurology, or medical explanation, the changeling story offered a way to understand illness, disability, and sudden loss, without blaming the parents or God. The fault lay not in neglect or sin, but in an interference from beyond the household. And because the danger was believed to be so real, then the belief also arose that countermeasures could be taken to prevent it. To modern eyes, the protections used against fairies can appear symbolic, even theatrical, but to medieval people they were neither ritual nor superstition. They were practical responses to a world understood to be layered, permeable, and shared. The logic was simple. If fairies were dangerous at boundaries, then boundaries must be reinforced. And the most important of these boundaries was the home. The medieval household was not merely a place of shelter, it was a fragile island of human order surrounded by land, forest, and darkness. Its safety depended on thresholds, doors, windows, hearths, and beds, each point where one world might intrude upon the other. Protection therefore focused on where crossing might occur, and iron stood at the centre of this defensive knowledge. Across Europe, iron was believed to repel fairies because it belonged wholly to the human world. It was mined from the earth, forged by fire, shaped by labour, and associated with blood, work, and mortality, all things the fair folk were thought to lack or fear. Iron was also seen as eternal. Human permanence made material, something that was the anathema of the shifting, transient world of the fairy. That is why iron appeared quietly, repeatedly, and without ceremony, beneath cradles, beside beds, above doorways, stitched into clothing, laid across thresholds. Knives, scissors, keys, nails, and horseshoes were all used not because they were sharp or symbolic, but because they were reliably iron. Any threshold or boundary that it was thought a fairy might cross would be reinforced and marked with this metal to declare human ownership. Beds, too, were spaces in between worlds. Sleep was a state of vulnerability, a partial withdrawal from the waking world. Children sleeping alone, especially before baptism, were thought to be dangerously exposed. That is why protection clustered around the cradle, iron beneath, blades nearby, and nothing proves the strength of this belief more than the fact we even have medieval sources tell us that iron was hung above the crib. Once baptized and named, it was felt that the newborn was rooted more firmly in the human world and less visible to the fairy gaze. Although iron was still needed in the house, it was at this point that the most extreme protection measures could be relaxed. And so, this was the situation in parts of Europe for centuries. But as the medieval era moved into the early modern period and beyond, belief in fairies began to change. Firstly, becoming very dark indeed before the threat was stripped away, the danger was made small, and the old folklore was replaced by wings, innocence, and fairy dust. By the late medieval period, belief in the fair folk had not vanished, but it had begun to change its place within European thought. Older explanations for misfortune were gradually displaced. Where sudden illness, infant death, or unexplained loss had once been attributed to fairies, attention increasingly turned elsewhere, toward witchcraft, diabolic influence, and human agency. During the great witch persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, fears that had once clustered around an unseen neighbour living in a fairy dwelling were redirected towards a very visible one. Women, particularly those associated with childbirth, healing, or midwifery, became increasingly vulnerable to accusation. Infant mortality, still tragically common, was no longer explained as the work of the fair folk, but as evidence of malefic human intent, the result of a satanic pact and an evil soul working for the devil. In this way, belief in witches drowned out fairy folklore. Countermeasures against fairies became far less prominent at a time when the devil was seen to stalk the land, and witches' bottles that prevented the entry of a witch into the home would now be found on thresholds of many houses, replacing the iron that was once found there. At the same time, religious change played its part. The Reformation encouraged direct engagement with Scripture, and the Bible made no mention of fairies. Beings that had never sat comfortably within Christian theology were now harder to believe in. The fair folk slipped further towards the margins, not denied entirely, but spoken of less seriously, and less often. As the modern world slowly unfolded, other pressures on the belief in fairies followed. Infant mortality declined. Medical explanations, however imperfect, multiplied. Legal systems grew more centralized. Landscapes were enclosed, surveyed, mapped, and regulated. Forests shrank, ruins were cleared, hills were quarried. The unknown places of the land, the hills, circles, and groves where fairies had once been thought to dwell, were steadily absorbed into the known world. Yet the fair folk did not completely disappear. It was in literature that the belief in fairies was preserved, but at the same time transformed. Shakespeare, drawing on medieval folklore, famously placed a fairy kingdom at the heart of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but instead of once feared, dangerous neighbours, he transformed them into playful, mischievous figures of comedy and enchantment. And it is here that we see one of the earliest popular literary moments in which fairies are imagined as beings that could fly, which was never part of medieval belief. This transformation that writers like Shakespeare had initiated in the late 16th century was complete by the 19th. Victorian writers and artists stripped the fairy of all threat. Fairies grew smaller, they acquired wings, they smiled, they posed among the flowers. The beings once feared as abductors of children were reimagined as companions of childhood itself, gentle, charming, and safe. Nothing illustrates this change more clearly than the case of the cottonly fairies. In 1917, two young girls in Yorkshire produced a series of photographs claiming to show fairies dancing at the bottom of their garden. The images caused a sensation. Newspapers debated them, experts analysed them, and remarkably many adults, including Arthur Conan Doyle, accepted them as genuine. The photographs were later exposed as a hoax, yet the moment remains extraordinary. Only a few centuries earlier, fairies had been treated as powerful, demanding beings whose presence inspired vigilance and fear. Now they were so thoroughly transformed that people wanted them to be real. They were harmless, beautiful companions to the imagination. The Cottonley Fairies incident showed that the belief in the fair folk had never truly vanished, but it had completely changed its shape. And what of you, traveller? When you see modern depictions of fairies, will you pause to think of them differently? To medieval folk, belief in fairies was not fantasy, but a belief in the unknown, in what lay just outside human perception, across a boundary that could not be mapped, and just beyond sight. The dangers of the fairy have long since passed from history, and the fear of the changeling has faded under the light of science and medicine. In their place remain today's small winged figures, playful, harmless, and safe. And yet, it is easy to forget that these gentle sprites were once thought of with care, respect, and fear, and that countermeasures were fully employed against them, even if only for a whisper in time.